a clear mandate.
Explain your example of the B-1 bomber.
Perfect example. You know, the B-1 bomber has a piece of it made, piece of the plane made in every single U.S. state. Now, why? I mean, that's not an efficient way to make a product. So it must be serving some end. And the end, it turns out, that it serves is that the B-1 bomber was designed by its makers according to a process called political engineering. Fancy word for distributing the contracts and subcontracts to build a given weapon system to as many states, as many congressional districts as possible. Not let's make it as efficient as possible, but rather let's put it in as many districts as possible so that if this thing ever comes up for review, everybody's getting a piece of the action. Everybody's in on it, and as a result, when, you know, the questions arise, do we need the B-1 bomber? Do we need to be spending this money? There's a constituency built in Congress that's going to keep that thing going. And what does that tell us? That tells us that, first of all, the defense sector is not alone in that. Every industry has their version of politically engineering Congress. But what it does is it puts the congressperson in a position of being a professional pleader to that corporation, that corporate interest, on behalf of them to the federal government. And it suborns, it really undermines the purity of their decision-making. It produces some of the very tragic and wrong-headed decisions that we've seen in recent years.
In both your film and your new book, The American Way of War, you interview Senator John McCain.
Yeah, I had the distinguished pleasure to interview John McCain.
Talk about that interview.
Well, you know, John McCain appeared in Why We Fight, and it was kind of an amazing story because audiences across the country really loved watching him in the film. And a lot of people said, wow, he's like a modern-day Eisenhower. You know, he's outspoken in the film. He criticizes American imperialism. He criticizes the military-industrial complex. He even goes to the length in the film of commenting on Halliburton and the sort of shadowy feeling that was given off by the no-bid contracts. He says in the film at one point, when asked what he thinks about the no-bid contracts, he says, it looks bad, it looks bad. And then when asked, well, what should be done about it, he says, I think there should be a public investigation of what went on. Well, that was great, and the public loved watching that. But again, if you watch how these forces of corruption transfigure and sort of disfigure our public policy and our public policy makers, within short order of having said that in the film then came out, and I got calls from John McCain's staffers, notably his lead staffer, Mark Salter, that were literally verbally abusive and were pressuring me as a lowly journalist person, and they were the big guys. They were pressuring me to modify my behavior, to change the film, or to give them the ammunition to have some sort of attack on me. They wanted to look into my files. They were extremely pointed in this attack. And why? Because the, as it were, Straight Talk Express had just started going. They were thinking, okay, this is going to head to the White House if we can play our cards right. And the last thing we need is a bunch of impolitic stuff that the maverick senator said in this movie. So they decided the point of least resistance was to go after me. They did that by smearing my name in the media. They went on to Roll Call, which is the Capitol Hill newspaper, and called me a slippery son of a gun and a bunch of other sort of funny adjectives. You know, it was an amazing window for me into, obviously that the Straight Talk Express is a farce, but beyond that, it was more a window into just how powerful the Washington paradigm of corruption is. Because what was he afraid of? He was afraid that he had offended Dick Cheney. And his staffers were afraid that by criticizing Halliburton, he never mentions the word Cheney, I think they equate Halliburton with Cheney, that he had overstepped that kind of invisible barrier that exists in Washington that protects the interests, the joint interests, the collusion of interests.
What most surprised you in doing the film and now the book, The American Way of War? And why'd you change the title from Why We Fight to The American Way of War? That reminds me of Jessica Mitford's American Way of Death. Yeah,
you know, I was going all over the country with the film, and I spoke to a lot of audiences. And I mean, I've spoken to thousands of people about this subject at this point, just in live audiences. And it was amazing to me the kind of questions I was getting and the kind of dialogue I was having with audiences. I've been teaching several times at West Point with this film. So I've been at military establishments and then in civilian audiences. And the range of questions spoke of a common humanity that we all share in trying to understand these very confusing issues. This country has gone in a direction, I don't care who you are, that nobody really understands. And the confusion of that seemed to me to be explainable, at least to some small degree, by understanding the way in which our military system took over our peaceable goals. And that basically, as Washington himself warned, he feared that overgrown military establishments, George Washington's term, were the enemy of Republican liberties. Small r republic, like rule of the people, all those good things, that you can't really have that during a time of war. Why? Because if you and I are sitting here right now and we're talking about democracy, and we care about democracy on a global scale, and a bomb dropped out on Lafayette Street right now, there's some small part of both of us that would say, there's no time to deliberate, just do something. It's a human impulse, no matter how stupid it is, it's a human impulse. We all think that for a certain moment. At that moment, when you move away from deliberation toward doing something, you move away from the legislative branch to the executive branch, because the executive does something. All of a sudden, there's no time for the whole stupidity of like the gavel in Congress and hear ye and the honorable senator from wherever and all that stuff. That just seems inappropriate to wartime. So what Madison said early on is, therefore, war favors the executive. That means that the executive wants war. That means that that congressperson I mentioned earlier, who's stuck in that conflict of interest where he's got to plead for his corporate benefactor, he's got to plead to the executive. Well, what does that mean? That means, and this is where the tragic joke ends, is that when he's pleading to the executive on a Monday because he wants to continue some weapon system, and he's contacting the DOD, with the Department of Defense, which is in the executive branch, well, on a Tuesday, when he's asking for that favor the day before, now the president's calling saying, I think there's WMDs in Iraq, and I'm hoping I can count on your support, Senator. Well, you're the guy asking for the favor. So just the day before, and now suddenly you're going to stand and say, you know, show me the evidence? You're going to go very quiet, which is what so many representatives did when their constituencies thought they might speak out. That issue, that quiet, that silence, in the book I call it the missing C, which is the missing Congress, has to do with how the American way of war came to trample the American way that many of us hold dear, and raises the question how to find our way back.
Eugene Jareki, I want to thank you for being with us. His new book, just out, is called The American Way of War: Guided Missiles, Misguided Men, and a Republic in Peril. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, a mother who lost her son, an Iraq War veteran. He died earlier this year, and about the same time learned that her house was being foreclosed on. It almost went on the auction block on Friday until the grassroots group Code Pink intervened. Jocelyn Voltaire